One of the things that I actually get a fair amount of in my life is when my students in courses like my Self-Service Business Intelligence Academy come to me and need some help in growing up their solutions. And they'll bring me a pivot table solution and we identify pretty quickly that, geez, this needs some DAX or it needs some more relationships, but it's been built on the classic pivot table setup. So then the job becomes, well, how do you rebuild the whole thing? How do you get your data into the data model? How do you build the required explicit measures and then recreate the pivot tables before you can even get started on really answering the question? So this obviously can take a lot of time depending on how complex the file is, and that's why I built the modern Pivot Monkey. The whole purpose of this monkey is to do all the legwork of converting a classic pivot table setup into the data model so that you can then start leveraging the rich features in the data model as far as relationships and DAX measures. Now, before I show you how the modern Pivot Monkey works, let's just take a look at what kind of a file I have in front of me and what things are going on in it, because we need to replicate as many of these as we possibly can. So right off the bat, you'll notice that we have a pivot table here. I've highlighted some cells here, and you'll see why that is when we get to the end of the demo. You'll notice that we have a slicer here. This one here, a group, is linked just to this pivot table. Location, though, is actually linked to multiple pivot tables. We also have a little timeline on here as well. So I'm going to leave this one unfiltered for the moment, and I'm going to hop over to Report 2. Notice that Report 2 has its own slicer here. I can slice to alcohol. I can slice to one division, tax evader, for example. And if I go back to Report 1, notice that this is not filtered group. That wasn't linked, but the location was. So that linkage between these pivot tables is important and something I need to replicate. Now I'm going to clear this out and just go back. Not that it matters. We can absolutely set these things if we want. Yeah, you know what? Let's try it. Let's set this one to ethical development. We're going to go to Report 3 now and take a look. And notice that this slicer here is not linked to the other ones, so that's good to know. Just a little pivot table layout there. And finally, I've got a pivot chart over here as well, which has a timeline, which again is not linked to the other things. Now let's take a look at the data source. The data source is on my raw data page, and what you can see immediately just by looking at it is that it probably doesn't have a table style applied. If I click inside, there's definitely no table tools that are coming up in the top here. Each of these pivots has been built against a range of data, which is really not the way we like to see things, and it's going to make it a little bit harder to get it into Power Query. So let's see how the modern Pivot Monkey does with this. We're going to go to Monkey Tools, Pivots and Filters, and we'll find Modern Pivot Monkey down here underneath the Modernize Classic Pivots heading. I'm going to open this up, and what you can see here is that we've got a few little different color-coded items here. The blue ones, or cyan, are the pivot tables that we're looking at. And we can actually click on the pivot table itself, and you'll notice that this will take us right to sales summary, sales by hour. We've got pivot for chart right here, and chart in this particular area as well. If I right-click on it, I can even rename this as well. So I could call this one, classic chart or something like that. There we go. We'll say OK, and we can actually rename it right off the bat. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to modernize all these things. So I'm going to go and I'm going to grab all of these guys right here and choose Modernize All Pivots. And what happens at this point in time is that our army of monkeys will go through and start looking at your workbook. We're going to identify what the data sources are. If there is a table in place, we'll pull that into Power Query. If it doesn't have a table style on it, we will create one, which we're just going to call PT source data for now, pivot table source data. And what you can see right now behind this is that we're going through and we're recreating every single worksheet here. Now it's really important to know this. I do not delete your original worksheets because I can't do everything. But I lay them out side by side so that you can then compare and port the remaining stuff if there's things that don't come across the way you want. Now at this point, upgrades are complete. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit close and we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at what we've got in place. Now the first thing you'll notice, we do have PT source data. This is definitely a Power Query with 140,000 rows going in it. So let's go and see if we can actually find our raw data. So here we go. Notice it's got a beautiful table style, and we can see that because the table design tab is active. So we've added this on with the name of PT source data. Now if you don't like that name, if you have Monkey Tools Pro, which we would to use this feature most likely, you can actually, of course, just rename it right here. We can call it transactions. And with a Monkey Tools Pro license active, it will automatically update your Power Query for you. If you're using a free version, it would not. Okay, you'd have to go back and fix the source step inside that particular query. Now, regardless of that, let's go back and take a look at our individual reports and what happened. So we'll start with report 1. Now, report 1, you can see, was filtered. It had some yellow highlighting on it. It had a timeline with 3 years, even though my original data did not have any 2013 data in it. It's just the way that pivot tables work. They give you that extra year sometimes. So that's the original pivot table. Let's go look at the data model report 1. Notice that it has not applied the filter for it, but the filter is set up. We'll see if it works in a second. One weirdly irritating thing about the pivot or about the timelines is they always do this kind of hidden, kind of weird thing here. So I just usually reset this to years and that actually goes and fixes it. Why that comes out, I don't know. But the main point I want you to notice is that all of these items are set up and you will prove out that they are linked correctly. And the pivot table format is the same. The one thing that I haven't been able to bring over for you though is the actual conditional formatting, coloring, things like that. Those don't come across. So if you've got conditional formatting rules, you'd need to add those unless I get enough requests to actually put that in place and build it out. Let's go take a look at report 2. This is the original, okay, with its filter in place. Let's go take a look at the data model report 2 version. So it looks pretty similar, except that, of course, this one's not filtered yet. So let's click on the filter here. You can see that we're filtering data model report 2. Should look identical to the original report 2 at this point. If I now go back to the data model report 1, we should see that this is indeed filtered and now looks consistent with what we have here, barring the colors. Okay. For report 3, this is the original. This is the data model version. You know, if I go and click just on this cell here and on this cell here, and we flip back and forth between the two, they're identical. The only thing that changes is the width of the columns that somebody's played around with over here, which are outside the pivot table to begin with. So that's pretty cool. Here's our original chart. Here's the data model version. Zoomed a little bit differently overall, but at the end of the day, the numbers are the same, everything looks good, and it should still work. So at this point, if I'm happy with these, I can go back and I can delete all of the original pivot table components from this, and I've now got just the data model version. So granted, there are going to be some minor things that you might have to tweak, but we do try and bring over as much as we possibly can with the pivot tables, including the position of subtotals and things like that. You might have to reset your filters. That's kind of a minor thing though, that really is a user-driven choice. But at the end of the day, 90–95% of the busy work here is done for you so that you can now focus on enhancing these with new DAX measures and so forth. For reference on this stuff too, it's important to realize when you go to the data model pivot tables here, and we go and we take a look at what we've created here, you'll notice that we create explicit DAX measures for every one of these items. We call them the same thing, but you can now go and rename them, which is kind of a nice bonus here as well. So there you go. That is the modern Pivot Monkey, which is designed to help you modernize your pivot tables and get away from classic right into the data model version with very little effort on your part so that you can then take advantage of the cool things that Power Pivot can do for you. Thanks for watching this episode of Using Monkey Tools. To get your own monkey, visit our website at monkeytools.ca. Or if you subscribe to Skillwave's Self-Service Business Intelligence Academy, you'll get a free annual pro license included with your subscription. And remember, Monkey Tools was developed to support better Excel and Power BI solutions. If you want to learn how to really master these tools, you should definitely check out our full course catalog at skillwave.training.